come down here, please, and take the paper from Bryson. Right, now every time you fold the paper, that's going to represent one generation of reproduction. So we start with one bacterium, that's one thickness of paper. Now fold it. Yes, if you both go the same end, it might be easier. Now we've got two. That's right. Crease it down there, that's right. Fold it, and then fold it across this way. Thank you. And just go on folding it until you've done it 50 times. So what have we got to now? 4? 4 bacteria? Right, 8. 16. 32. Well, can't you do any more? Right, that's probably... All right, it looks as though they're not going to make it. We're going to have to resort to mathematics to calculate how thick that paper would be. Okay, thank you very much. Do sit down. Okay. In every generation, of course, the thickness of the paper doubles. So we go 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and so on. We go on multiplying by 2 50 times. After we've multiplied by 2 50 times, what have we got? We've got a very big number indeed. We've got, in fact, 1,000 trillion, of one with 15 noughts after it. The sheet of paper is 1/10 of a millimeter thick. If you multiply that by 1,000 trillion, you end up with, I've got it written down here, 100 million kilometers. The thickness of the paper would take us out to the orbit of Mars. The number of bacteria after a mere 50 generations is that. But 50 generations is nothing to bacteria. They can get through 50 generations in a day. After about a week, bacteria, the number of bacteria would be more than 1 billion times the number of atoms in the known universe. Well, that's called exponential growth, what mathematicians call exponential growth. We'll come back to it. Needless to say, it doesn't happen to the same extent, at least. After a point, natural factors come to regulate the size of the population of bacteria. Our original assumption that it was easy to become an ancestor was wrong. Only an elite become ancestors. You can do the same sort of calculation, by the way, for ourselves or for elephants, as Charles Darwin did, and it just takes a little bit longer, but the same idea is there. After a fairly short number of years, you'll find that the entire universe is filled with elephant flesh or human flesh or whatever it is. So it follows that most organisms that are born must die without becoming ancestors, without becoming distant ancestors. Only an elite are destined to become ancestors. Well, some people don't like the word elite, but I just mean that it won't be all luck which ones end up ancestors. The ones that are going to be ancestors will tend to be the ones that are good at it. They'll tend to be the ones that have what it takes. Have what it takes to survive, to get a mate, to reproduce, to avoid being eaten, to find food, to be good parents, and so on. That's really just a way of putting Darwin's theory of natural selection. Because we that are left, we that survive, will have inherited the genes of a long line of successful ancestors. We'll have inherited whatever it took to make them successful as ancestors. But for the moment, I want to emphasize something else, which is that we are lucky to be alive. We're lucky to be alive because it would have been so easy for our ancestors not to have been here. It would have been so astronomically probable that somebody else would have been here rather than us. And we're lucky to be alive for another reason. Think about it this way. The universe is about 14,000 million years old. That's 140 million centuries. Some 60 million centuries from now, the sun will become a red giant and engulf the Earth. So there are about 200 million centuries from the origin of the universe to the end of the world. Now, of the 140 million centuries since time began, every one of them was once the present century. And of the 60 million centuries to the end of the world, every one of them will be the present century. The present century is a tiny spotlight inching its way along a gigantic ruler of time. Everything before the spotlight is in the darkness of the dead past. Everything after the spotlight is in the darkness of the unknown future. We live in the spotlight. Of all the 200 million centuries along the ruler of time, 199,999,999 centuries are in darkness. Only one is lit up, and that's the one in which we happen, by sheer luck, to be alive. The odds against our centuries happening to be the present century are the same as the odds against a penny tossed out at random on the road from London to Istanbul happening to fall on a particular ant. Well, in spite of those odds, you may have noticed that we are, as a matter of fact, here. And it really, of course, it's not surprising. We're here because we're the ones doing the calculation. If somebody has just done the calculation that we've just done, then that somebody, of course, has to be alive. Nevertheless, I do feel rather lucky to be alive, and for another reason, too. Now, the smoke going into the beam represent stars. Each particle of smoke represents one star. And you can think of the beam as a gigantic searchlight beamed out from space and signaling from our planet in the hope that somebody else on another world will pick up the message. We don't know how likely it is that there is anybody up there. We can say that if our message does hit another planet, then almost certainly it'll be so far away that if those people up there had a telescope looking back at us, then what they would be seeing is not us at all, but the dinosaurs that was here 65 million years ago. Or in other words, our message will reach people millions of years into the future. People vary in their estimates of how much life there is likely to be, how likely there is to be life on other planets. Some people think that, some scientists think that as many as 10 million technologically advanced civilizations are out there. Other people feel that this life here on this planet is the only life that there is. But even on the most extremely optimistic estimate, it's still true that most of those worlds out there are going to be deserts. Most of them are not going to have any life on them at all, nor even any possibility of life on them at all. Now imagine a spaceship full of sleeping, perhaps deep frozen explorers, would-be colonists of another world. Perhaps they're the last population of Earth, despairing that Earth is about to be destroyed, sending out a colony to look for another planet anywhere in order to carry on humanity. Imagine that the spaceship turns out to be almost unthinkably lucky. It does chance to arrive at one of the very, very rare planets capable of sustaining our kind of life, a planet of the right temperature with oxygen, and so on. The passengers wake up and stumble out into the light, and they see a beautiful world of waterfalls, green leaves, mountains, coloured animals and bird-like creatures flitting about. Can you imagine how it would feel if you woke up, perhaps after 100 million years of sleep in a spaceship, and found yourself on such a world? A whole new world, a world that such as you could live on, a beautiful world. You'd surely bless your luck in arriving on such a rare world, walk around in a daze, a trance, unable to believe the wonders that met your eyes and ears. Well, this will almost certainly never happen to us. And yet, in a way, it's just what has happened to us. We have woken up after hundreds of millions of years of sleep. Admittedly, we didn't arrive by spaceship, we arrived by being born. But the wonder of the planet, the dazzling surprise of it, is the same, whether we arrive by spaceship or by birth canal. We are amazingly lucky to be here, privileged, and we must not waste that privilege. Here, it seems to me, lies the best answer to those narrow-minded people who are always carping on about the use of science. The founder of these Christmas lectures, Michael Faraday, was once asked by the then Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, what was the use of science? Sir, Faraday replied, what is the use of a baby? her name's Hannah. Faraday said, "What is the use of a baby?" And I've always thought that what he meant by that must be that a baby has such potential. It may not be able to do very much now, but it will be able to do a lot. But it's also possible that what Faraday meant is that there's no point in bringing a baby into the world if all that it's going to do is work to go on living. To go on living and work to go on living again. If that's all the point of life, then what are we here for? There's got to be more to it than that. Some of life must be devoted to living itself. Some of life must be devoted to doing something worthwhile with one's life, not just to perpetuating it. This is, of course, how people quite rightly justify spending taxpayers' money on the arts and on conserving rare species. But sometimes when we justify academic science on those grounds, people get rather Philistine and say things like, "Oh, so you think the government should spend money on your scientific research because your research is fun for you, do you?" Fun isn't really the right word, is it? After sleeping for 140 million centuries, we have finally woken up in the universe. We've opened our eyes on a wonderful planet, filled with colour, teeming with life. Before very long, we shall have to close our eyes again. Finding out about the universe in which we've woken up, answering questions like, what are we doing here? What is this universe in which we've woken up? What is life, and what, if anything, is it for? Surely the enterprise that answers questions like that, science, deserves a better title than fun. Put like that, doesn't science sound to you like just about the most worthwhile way in which you could possibly spend your short time in the spotlight? Now, of course, if you spent all your time wandering around the world gasping at everything and saying how wonderful, how amazing, I've woken up after 100 million centuries, what a trip, people would think you were a bit odd and you might even get arrested. We do, of course, have an ordinary life to get on with. We do have a living to earn. We've got to earn our living being a solicitor or a laboratory cleaner or something like that. But nevertheless, it is worthwhile also from time to time shaking off the anesthetic of familiarity and awakening to the wonder that is really all around us all the time. So how are we going to shake off the anesthetic? We can't actually go to another planet, but fortunately we don't need to, because we can go to regions of our own planet which are so unfamiliar that they almost might be another planet. This is another planet. This is Jupiter. It's a fantasy picture of Jupiter conceived by the astronomer Carl Sagan, and he's imagining life forms that might live in the upper atmosphere of Jupiter, called floaters. If there were life forms in Jupiter, they would be called Jovians. So let's use the word bijovians for creatures on this Earth that are so odd that they might almost be from another planet. Here, for instance, is a deep-sea fish. You would have to go on a long journey in a submarine or in a diving suit to see that fish. This is exactly the same species of fish. The only difference is that this has just had a meal and that hasn't. That's looking for a meal, as you can tell from its ravening jaws. These creatures look pretty monstrous to us. I suppose by their standards, we might be thought monstrous. This one is another deep-sea fish. This has a luminous lure made by bacteria, luminous bacteria, and it uses this as a bait to lure prey into its vicinity. It then slams its fishing rod down into the vicinity of its jaws, opens them, and gulps in the prey. A very weird bijovian creature. We don't even have to go to the deep sea, as a matter of fact, to see pretty weird creatures. I was once attending a lecture by a colleague who worked on octopuses, and he said the fascination with octopuses is these are the Martians. And he meant that, look at this creature could easily be from Mars, couldn't it? Watch the colour change. That creature, that cuttlefish, it's not an octopus, it's a cuttlefish, is changing colour at will. Look at the waves of colour falling over it. That's not shadows falling over it from outside. That's internally controlled by the animal, by its own nervous system. It's registering emotion, signalling to other creatures, others of its own species, bijovian creature. We don't even have to go to the sea at all. These are all insects. They all have the same basic insect body plan, which they inherited from a common insect ancestor which lived about 350 million years ago. They all look like insects because they've inherited those attributes. They all have a head, a thorax, an abdomen, but in this case it's enormously elongated to look like a stick. Here, the same body is flattened out in this bug. Again, the head, thorax, abdomen, 3 pairs of legs, antennae, wings. Here, butterflies, the same basic body plan, pulled and stretched, kneaded into different shapes. But basically the same shape. They've never quite shaken off their ancestral influence. But we were talking about shaking off our anesthetic of soporific familiarity. And another way to achieve the illusion of waking up on a distant planet is to shrink ourselves, to go on a different kind of journey, to a much smaller scale than we're used to. This is a dust mite. It's the sort of thing that you've met often in the carpets of your own home, but didn't know it. It's hugely magnified by an instrument like this, which is a scanning electron microscope. And we can use the scanning electron microscope just as though it was a telescope pointing at some distant planet. So strange are the sights that it shows us. I think we have a volunteer to work the electron microscope. Now, your name is? Louise. Louise. Do sit down, Louise. Now, on the screen at the moment, we have what looks like a jungle. We can think of it as a jungle on another planet. Now, you know how to work the joystick and navigate around. You also know how to zoom out and in. What about zooming out and seeing what this jungle really is? Okay, let's go slowly now. There's some curious rounded objects there. Go further. 2 little patches of rounded objects. Go further. Go on. Right, now I think what we're seeing is the head of a mosquito. There are the compound eyes, lots of different facets of the compound eyes on either side. In the middle are the sockets of the antennae. Zoom out further. And again. And there's the whole head. You can see the whole round head with the sockets for the antennae and the rounded compound eyes with all the different facets. Now perhaps we can navigate to a different insect. Yes, the machine has been pre-programmed to move now to a different part of this strange landscape. And I hope we're going to see something else in a minute. What's this here? Looks like another jungle. So let's move around and explore what we think it is. I can't see anything yet. Oh, wait a minute. Let's zoom out a bit and see whether we can see better then. Again. Again. Oh, that's looking like something. I think that's a pair of wings off to the left side, isn't it? So I think that might be the thorax of an insect of some sort. Let's try moving that way and see what we see. Other way. Let's speed it up a little bit. That's right. Ah, it's the abdomen of a bee, I would think. Go on. More. Now, what's that? There's something curious poking out. Try and steer your way around so that's in the middle. Other way. And then down a bit. Now zoom into it. I'll keep steering, shall I? Right, zoom in. Need a bit of focus, I think. Can you do that? It looks to me like the head of something else. Zoom out again. What that is, as a matter of fact, is a tiny parasite. Thank you very much indeed, Louise. It's a tiny insect parasite called a strepsipteran, which is parasitizing a bee, and what you saw was the strepsipteran poking out below the armor plating of the bee there. There's its compound eyes, and there's its body, and that is one armor plate of the bee. So we've been on a journey using the scanning electron microscope, to the world of the very small. And that's another way of capturing the strangeness of our own world. Yet another way is to go into our own bodies and look at the detailed structure of our own bodies. For example, this is a picture of a human brain. And each of these black things is one brain cell. And you can see how many there are. There are only a tiny fraction of them staying to be seen here. And the bewildering forest of interconnections between them. The total length of nerve cells in a human brain, if laid end to end, would stretch right round the circumference of the world, not just once, but 25 times. Well, that's not in itself a very interesting fact. For one thing, if you actually did that, and you sent a message from one end of this vast, great nerve to the other, it would take about 6 years to get to the other end of the nerve. What's truly impressive about the nervous system is not the sheer number of elements, but their connectedness. The complexity of the connections is truly awesome. Here is just 4 or 3 nerve cells, and these are the connections between them. There are about 2,000 wires connecting each nerve cell to each other nerve cell. So the total number of connections in the brain must be about 200 million. To put that into perspective, if we assume that each of those connections is equivalent to one switching unit of a computer, this gives the brain about 10 million times as many switching elements as a typical desktop computer. Brains are impressive because of the number and connections of their cells, but there are lots of other different kinds of cells in the body, and they all have the same basic structure inside. This is a typical animal cell, a model of a typical animal cell. And it's not just a bag of juice, it's filled with membranes. It's got a structure, an internal structure. Each of these blue things here is a membrane. And every cell has them in large amounts, such that the total area of membrane inside a typical human body is about 200 acres. That's a good-sized farm. What are they all doing? Well, they aren't just sort of stuffing or folded wadding. Those membranes, in many cases, are chemical factories, particularly the ones in these bodies called mitochondria, the orange ones here. They are made of membrane, and in those membranes, in every bit of those membranes, is going on chemistry. They are chemical factories. This here is a map of the chemical reactions in every cell. Mind-bogglingly complicated, stupefyingly complicated. Every one of these arrows is one chemical reaction. Yet all of that is going on all the time inside the membranes of every mitochondrion in every cell in you. And the number of mitochondria in which that's going on all the time is such that if you laid all your mitochondria end to end, they would go around the world not once, not 25 times, but 2,000 times. In the nucleus of the cell, right in the center, is the DNA. The DNA, the magic molecule, the molecule of life, the most important molecule in the world. That molecule conveys the information from generation to generation about how to build a body. The total amount of information is such that if you were to eat a steak, when you eat a steak, every time you do it, your teeth are mangling, are shredding the equivalent of 1 billion copies of the Encyclopedia Britannica. That's the kind of destructive work you can do with your teeth. Hemoglobin is the molecule that carries oxygen in the blood. You can see it, the shape of it is complicated. It's very complicated, and what's remarkable about it is that the same shape is going on all the time in all the different molecules. That you can think of the hemoglobin molecule as rather like a truck for carrying oxygen. Each hemoglobin molecule drives around carrying oxygen from one part of the body to another. It's a vehicle for carrying oxygen. But I've just got 6 little trucks here. What's remarkable about hemoglobin is that the number of them in your bloodstream is not just 6, it's 6,000 million, million, million. And they're all very complicated, they all look like that, they all look exactly the same as each other. And they're all being destroyed and new ones being created all the time in your blood at a rate of 400 million, million every second. Another way to shake off the anesthetic of familiarity, another way to experience something a little bit like going to another planet, is to go on another kind of journey backwards in time on our own planet. The best way to do this would be with a time machine, but even Bryson Gore and the Royal Institution can't lay on a time machine for us, so we have to use fossils. One of the most difficult things to grasp about fossils, like this trilobite here, is how old they are. You can have no conception how old that animal is. In case that sounds patronizing, let me rephrase it. I can have no conception how old it is. I can tell you in words how old it is. It's about 500 million years old, perhaps a bit more. But to tell you in words, and really to understand what that means, is another matter. Our brains have evolved to comprehend the timescales of our own lifetimes. We can understand seconds, minutes, days, weeks, years, even centuries we can understand. When we come to millennia, thousands of years, our spines start to tingle. Epic myths like Homer's Odyssey, tales of the Greek gods, Zeus and Apollo and the others, the Jewish heroes, Moses and Joshua and their god Yahweh, the ancient Egyptians and the sun god Ra, these all give us an eerie feeling of immense age. We feel that we're peering back into the mists of antiquity. Yet on the timescale of this fossil, those mists of antiquity don't even count as yesterday.